American Rose Society. I'm interested in information.
Okay, good morning.
Great.
My name is Gary Matsuoka, and we're here at the Blue Hills Nursery in Santa Ana, and today's class is on basics of growing roses. And pretty much I'll be telling you, because roses are treated different all around the country, and I'll be telling you what we do here. So I started growing roses around 1980. And at one time, our store was growing. Well, we had a display that had about 5,000 roses in it. So we were growing, we're selling between 10 and 12,000 roses a year during the 1990s. Um, but in the 1990s, we had some new diseases that suddenly made it more difficult for big operations of roses, especially nurseries. And public also saw the same problems, more diseases, more pests in the U.S. on roses. And from that time on, the rose industry shrank for a while, in fact, all the way until the pandemic started. And suddenly we had a lot more gardeners interested, and the rose business is starting to expand again. We'll see what happens. Now, the one thing about roses to know is that they rarely die from bugs or diseases or anything. They're pretty strong plants. If you want perfect roses, it's a lot of work. So before I was married, I had a rose garden of 50 roses, and I'd be out there about 2 hours a week, making sure there wasn't a single yellow leaf, a single bug, no holes, perfect roses. That's what it takes. About 2 hours a week in a 50 rose garden. I had a few friends who had, 300 rose gardens, and that took longer than that. But then when I got married and had kids, I'd spend maybe an hour a month. And it didn't look, from the street, it didn't look any different. So if you don't need perfect roses, and most people don't need a perfect rose, forest quality plants, then it's not that hard to do it. You have to put up with a few diseases and bugs, but they're not going to just keel over on you if you don't take care of it. So very resilient plants. So most roses are still grown in the Central Valley. Um, Generally, a 2-year crop, and when we get them, we'll get them in a few. In fact, we'll get them in 4 or 5 days, and generally they'll look about like this. So they're grown in the ground for at least a year, sometimes 2 years. Uh, Generally, you have your root system down here. And then they're most of them are grafted still on the top. So you have branches coming up about like this. Of course, they've got their thorns on them. Um, and this is about how big they will be when we get them. So you can see this rose here, which was a bare root a year ago. What we do with them is when we grow them in containers, we do usually trim them down about this height, about 6-inch stems, so they don't, so because we don't take a lot of care of them when they're real young, so we just put them in a pot, water them every once in a while, and they start growing. Some people like to leave the stems longer, but then you have to worry a little bit about them drying up. Now, when we get them, we clean them up for you because when they pull them out of the ground, essentially when the rose growers throw them into the ground, they plow them out of the ground, they bundle them into bundles, they cut the stems with a bandsaw, so they're all different lengths. A lot of breakage in there, a lot more branches than are needed. So we clean them up when we get them down to between 3 and 8 stems or so. and then sell them that. We see how sell them quite cleaned up. We try to get the stem shorter than a foot. Sometimes they come in, they're well over a foot long. We know if they're that long, and we don't have consistent rain every, twice a week or so, they're going to dry up in the air. So we cut them shorter. So what happens when they pull them out of the ground? The roots are in shock, so they're not operational till they're in the ground at your house for about 2 weeks. It takes them about 2 weeks in the ground to recover, get their function back so they can maintain water to the leaves until to the stems, that is. Because even though the stems are covered with wax, they're not totally waterproof. And just sitting out there in a hot, sunny condition, say Santa Ana condition, they can actually shrivel up and dry up. So we do recommend certain things. We have planting guides that we give you that show you the options you can do. But generally, what you do when you get a rose home, we have them in real thick plastic bags that the thorns have trouble penetrating, so you don't get poked too badly. And you keep the bags, they're clear plastic bags, in a shady, cool location. Don't You can bring them inside, but they'll start growing real fast indoors. Better to leave them outside in the shade. However, this year we're a lot colder than last. If they do have a frost warning, bring them in the garage at least, or at least in the patio, because if they freeze outside in a bag, it's severely damaged. The roots of a plant are subject to freezing. The tops actually can handle the freezing, well, down to a certain temperature. California doesn't get that cold. If you're in Minnesota, you can lose your stems if it gets negative 20 degrees, they'll die. But generally, the stems can handle down to probably 20, even 10 degrees. The roots, though, they can't go below freezing at all. And generally, the ground in the U.S., lower 48 states, does not freeze. Lower 49 states does not freeze. So anyway, so you store them outside in the shade, plant them as soon as you can. Usually within 2 weeks is recommended because they're growing. If we're not, if we don't stay in the 50s in the daytime, they're growing. So we try to make holes. Now, soil-wise, they're not that picky. So roses can grow in just about anything. They don't like, now, if you've got, normal sandy soil, they love that. I mean, if you're a florist, if you want to grow roses like florists grow 'em, you make a bed of pure sand. So most florist roses are grown in pure sand because they get really long stems in sand. They're more vigorous. Um, One of our customers was in Saudi Arabia on with in a living in a motorhome on sand, or a trailer on sand, and he grew roses. He said they were taller than his trailer. So you get those long stems. So the forest roses are grown in sand. Just know I've tried that and way too tall for landscape. So I had four abundance that were this tall. My height tastes like this. I said, well, that's not right. Um, but if you want to grow them specifically for cut flowers, that's one way you can get the really long stems on them. So they're not picky about dirt. I mean, they'll grow in compost, but we don't recommend that. We recommend just actual dirt. The soil we have, when we grow them in the nursery in containers, we use our top pot in these buckets this size. Um, this has no compost in it. Now they can grow in compost, but the root system's not quite as good as it would be if they were in something other than compost. So compost, by definition, is dead, rotten plants, and a lot of nutrition in that, but it's not a great place for plant roots, although rose is real tolerant. We're amazed that rose can do that. Um, I mean, this grower here that we got this rose from grows them in redwood shaving, 75%, and they look okay. They don't look as good as when we grow our roses. They come out generally greener, looking better without the compost in it. But that's not bad. We'll go with that. So roses grow in the worst potting soils that they make. We make a much better one, better than they have to have. So they're not as picky about dirt, but if you have a lot of compost in the ground, you got to have better drainage. Whereas if you've got just regular soil, no compost in it, the drainage is not that important, not as important. Now, placement of roses, there's two schools of thought. You put all your roses in one bed, but then when you treat them, you treat them all at one time. But the more isolated they are, the fewer diseases they get, the fewer bugs they get. So know that too. If you have one rose in your front yard and that's it, you rarely see disease on that thing at all. No matter where you put it, you just have one rose, it's not going to get much. If you have a bed of 50 roses, yeah, you're going to see everything. Because it's easier for the bugs and diseases to find that group of 50 roses than it is just one rose. So, like in my house right now, the current house I'm at, I've got 3 roses spaced about 8 foot apart. I don't treat them for much at all. But my first house, yeah, we'd have to treat them for just about everything that you can think of that was out there because they were so close together that the bugs and diseases go from plant to plant to plant. So there's either way, I mean, they look better when you have a lot of them because the average, say, cut rose that make cut flowers like this one, might see 4 or 5 flowers open at any one time, which doesn't do a whole lot. If you've got 4 or 5 of these in a row, then you get more flowers, better flower shows. So at rose gardens, you always see like 20 of the same type. So you can actually see the flowers. Now this is a cutting rose. There are a lot of landscape roses. Like this is a landscape rose with smaller flowers, generally a lot more smaller flowers, so you don't need as many plants in a row to make it stay. So we classify our roses that we sell in 2 categories: cut roses versus the landscape roses. And landscape roses, they have different kinds: floribundas, shrubs, miniatures, we call them, all the landscape roses. And then the other ones, the larger flowers, we'll call the cut flower roses or the hybrid teas. This is the hybrid tea. And grandiflores we keep in that same category. And then there's the climbers that we use on a fence. So we just break them down in 3 now. Next late winter, we'll be selling roses in tree form too.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So about the soil, you said that they're not that picky, but if we're not planting them in containers, if we're planting them directly in the ground, is muddy California, Southern California soil okay? Okay. And then my other question was, you said that it's better as far as the hinges if they're far apart, but can you put like in between those? Can you put smaller flowers that are not roses?
Yes.
Without risking again this like massive disease phenomenon?
Yeah, anytime you mix up your crop, you're going to have fewer bugs and disease on that crop. Doesn't matter what it is. The roses for certain. Yeah, at my last house, I had roses surrounded by daylilies. I had roses surrounded by geraniums, things like that. So,
Thank you.
and you can break a lot of rules. I mean, the first house I bought, there was a rose on the north side of it that was in shade half the year. I'm going, this is odd. Why'd they plant it here? But it did fine. I mean, it got maybe 2 or 3 hours of sun a day, and it did fine. And then again, if you live in different locations, like my in-laws used to live in Hemet. There, they grow all the roses in shade. They can't take the heat there, so they grow them on the north side of the house. They look fine. So it depends where you are. If you have a lot of humidity, it's nice to get them out more open, close to the ocean. we have a lot of problems with certain diseases. So anyway, when you plant them, make a hole big enough to get the roots in. Generally, the roots will be less than a foot deep on the bare root roses. I mean, it's funny, we used to have a rose grower, Howard's Hemet, that used to grow them in real sandy soil. And because of that, we get these roses with carrot roots that went straight down like 2 or 3 feet. It's like they went out of business then after a while because the roots wouldn't spread out. They would just go straight down in that sandy soil that they had. Most of the rose growers now are Wasco, California, near Fresno, clay soil or heavy soil. That makes the rose roots stay near the surface and go sideways and be more fibrous. So that's one reason they grow them in that kind of soil so that we don't get these carrot roots, 1 or 2 roots go straight down real deep. That doesn't package too well. So you make a hole big enough to get them in without bending them too badly. Now the original level, so you can see the stem of your rose, it turns green at a certain point, and now is above ground. Usually they're grafted about 2 or 4 inches above the soil level, so that's the original level. However, if you're in Minnesota, you plant them this deep. You got to bury that protect from the cold in the winter. So back in the 80s, I saw an article written by people who moved here from the north. They said, "Well, why do you grow your roses so shallow?" And we always plant them real deep, and they're protected from the cold. I decided to try that, so I planted my roses this deep. They did fine. They root out of their stems, and that'll probably help them live longer to do that. You get a bigger root system that way. Just be aware, if you bury the roots too deep, you can lose the bottom of your roots if your soil is too heavy. If it's sandy or you amend the soil, make it real loose, these roots will stay alive too. But if you bury your roots suddenly way deeper than they used to be, sometimes they'll die from suffocation. So roots on roses need a lot of air. They usually stay within the top 8 inches of the soil. Um, you can, again, if you have put sand in the hole or have, amend your soil with a lot of sand or pumice or something, make it more airy, the roots will go deeper. So, okay, so you plant them good, make a nice, after you put the dirt back in, you kind of get the dirt between the roots. I mean, a lot of texts still say make a mound here to put the roots over that. I've seen very few rows that have roots that would fit over a mound. So you just put the roots in here, make sure the soil's sifted through the roots, and then make your nice basin around the outside. And then, unless the soil's really muddy, you'll have to flood it a couple times, just fill it with water, let it settle. Watch your rows during the first fill and drain because a lot of times when the soil settles, it settles crooked. So hold your rows, try to hold your rows straight. Because sometimes when it settles, they kind of lean a bit, which, it's not going to hurt the rows in the long run, but it might look funny short run. Now the roses are grafted on one side of the stem. The ones that are grafted, just so you know, there's 2 ways to grow roses nowadays. Um, Traditionally, they've been grafted, so they have a different rose stem that they stick in the dirt in January or whenever they plant their fields, and it grows roots in the top. It's actually a climbing rose they use for the roots. And then in June they come around and cut that off, put a graft of the rose you want on the side of that, so they kind of grow off the side of this. And usually it's shaped like the stems come in, they shape like this. They're not all the way around that stem they're grafted to. So they do recommend that on the open side of your rose, you face that south, so it'll draw the new canes toward the sun and fill in that gap. Now, roses often don't do exactly what you want. That means I had a rose once that had one cane, never made a single another cane. Wouldn't do it from the base anyway, where we like to see lots of stems from the bottom. That rose stayed with one stem all its life. And that's all it would do. So they don't often do what you want, but if you want to do what's best, then you put the open side toward the sun, the most sunlight, and see if you can get it to do what you want. So if we have weather like this where it's humid, not too much air movement, roses are cut to about 6 or 8 inch stems. You got the ground wet, you're fine. If we have a bad sand condition come up, and what we do is after you water this, you take all this mud and wet dirt you just made and pile it up to about there. Just dig a hole around your rose, pile that dirt up to there, keep it there till you see the sprouts start up, and then wash it off. Now, one year I tried putting planter mix over this thing. That's a mistake. So planter mix the way it's sold is compost, and the role of compost is to eat up any plant material. So I took it off, and I noticed all my leaves were half eaten up by the compost. They were getting dissolved into the compost. Compost is not good around leaves. It's okay around the stem. The stem is meant to handle compost, but the leaves they can't handle it. Can't handle compost as it comes out of a bag. So dirt's the best. Our potting soil without compost in it can work too. I mean, at the nursery, sometimes we'll get a real dry rose. We'll just wrap it in a wet blanket and leave it in the shade, and that works too. Or in a bucket of water, totally submerged in a bucket of water will work too. So, and if you buy a rose from a big box store and it's been in a dry bag for a week, and the stems are all like shriveling up like prunes, you can often resuscitate those. So rarely use a rose unless it's been really, really dry for a long time. So usually within 2 weeks we expect these to sprout. If they don't sprout in 2 weeks, something happened. You leave them in a bag, a plastic bag out in the sun for a half a day, you might burn it up. So that's one thing that can happen. Hot car for a long time. Frozen roots, which happens rarely. We only had one year where we had frozen roots. That was 1990 at 23 degrees. Couldn't believe it. So, like being up north somewhere. Anyway, so within 2 weeks, you should see leaves coming up. You can wash this dirt down, get it off the canes, or you can leave it. It's not a big deal to leave it on the canes. They're fine. So usually we have a grace period where you don't do much. You watch it. Now, if we have an El Nino winter where it just rains and rains and rains and never dries up, you look at your rose and you'll see a lot of leaves that are turning yellow and purple, kind of like this. Now, this probably is from dryness during the Santa Ana, but there's a disease out there that came to us in the early 90s called downy mildew disease, which during really, really wet weather. Now, most homeowners never see this, especially in Southern California, because the roses aren't packed together like they're in a nursery. I mean, in a nursery, we just put our roses when we're growing them can to can. So there's no air circulation there. So when the leaves stay wet and it's cold, they can get this disease that in the East Coast would look like uh, down on your roses. We never see that here. We're not humid enough. We're not like New Jersey or anything like that where the humidity hovers around 90%. So we don't see that part, but we see the roses turn yellow with a little bit of purpling in them, and then they start dropping off the plants. Then we have to treat them with fungicides to stop it. Generally, you don't see that in people's houses. The roses are farther apart; they dry out. Um, but know that it's cold that does it. So once it warms up, it totally stops. I mean, someone on the East Coast, I think they were in Connecticut, they said, "Oh, I just took my hose out there connected to my hot water faucet, my hot water thing on my washing machine, and hit them with 120-degree water. Cured them overnight. That's ingenious way of doing it, but Downey does not like it above 80 degrees. So once we hit 80 degrees, it totally stops. So generally, you don't have to treat. However, if you want to know how we treat it, we usually use garden cloths, which is it's a fertilizer that's used as a fungicide. There's other fungicides out there that treat Downy too, but in my house, I've never had it treated. It's just not that big a problem. Now, during late winter, if it's still raining, and early spring, if it's still raining, we often get something called black spot, which maybe I'll pass out these booklets. You can look at some photos in them.
That's in warmer weather.
Well, black spot doesn't like it like this. It likes it in the 60s, 70s, and up into the 80s. So we don't usually see black spot if it's cold, real cold. We see downy. Then when it gets warmer, we see more black spot. So on a leaf with black spot, you'll see this real fuzzy large spot. This kind of fuzzy black spot forms, a big one. And then the whole leaf turns yellow and falls off. So that's black spot. We don't get that too often. So California, up until 1990, didn't have black spot. We didn't have it here. One of the problems we had in the industry was that the main breeders were in California. So they weren't breeding for black spot. In fact, Jackson Perkins, which used to be the biggest nursery in the world, their breeding grounds were about 3 miles from here, 4 miles from here in Irvine. So they didn't get black spot. They didn't get hardly any diseases where they were. They were like in the perfect location to avoid a lot of diseases. So they would sell the roses throughout the country, and they would just get hammered. I mean, that was a big problem because they were going in California. Weeks, another big grower, was growing them in Southern California also. Their breeding grounds were here. So they had to do a big turnaround in the 1990s and start putting test gardens all around the country to see what the roses were like in the rest of the country, because a lot of the roses they were breeding here couldn't even handle the cold. I mean, we had a rose in the 1960s and 70s. This one, Color Magic, absolutely, it was that big. I mean, it was absolutely gorgeous. But I noticed in my garden in Lake Forest, the stems were dying from the cold in the winter. Even there, they were dying. It was so delicate. So there's no way you can grow this rose anywhere except in Southern California, because it would totally get killed by the cold. So they really had to change the breeding, at least their test grounds, to make sure the rose can handle the diseases and the pests around the country. Anyway, black spot, you might see around April gets warm enough for mildew. So mildew is when you get this white fuzzy stuff on your new growth. The rose leaves tend to roll a bit. The the buds will get covered with a white fuzz. So April through June is mildew season. So mildew likes above 55, below 85, and humidity at night, but not water. Mildew does not like water. Doesn't like rain, because mildew is a surface disease. So if you water your roses a lot, they won't get mildew. They'll get black spot. They won't get mildew. Um, so we know the Portland Rose Garden decided that they would turn on sprinklers every morning for about 30 seconds. And they said, well, boy, we got rid of a lot of bugs and diseases by rinsing them off in the morning to get rid of that dew that was on the leaves, the humidity. So a lot of mildew spores, they're in that little droplets of dew, and it takes them a few hours to penetrate the leaf and get going. If you wash them off, they can't do it. So, I mean, when I was a kid, I noticed my dad would be out there in the morning, every morning, washing off his roses. That's what we did in the 60s because we didn't have all these fungicides back then, and one way to get rid of mildew was to wash it off. But now, we have black spot nowadays, so you have to be careful. And rust. So rust is another disease that you can get any time when the leaves stay wet for 4 hours or more. Um, So the main thing in fact, what's interesting is when it's raining, they can't catch any of these diseases because the rain's constantly washing the spores off the leaf. It's the time after the rain's over and the water sits there for a long time. That's when they catch those diseases. So if you were to go out after rain and the rain's over, it's over, uh, you can actually shake your roses a bit, get that excess water off them. That's a bit of work. I mean, I've never done that, but or take a leaf blower out there and blow the water off the leaves. You're less likely to get disease on them because that water's not sitting there long enough to do it. So when you water your roses, it's better to water them at a time of day when they'll drop within 4 hours. So not too early in the morning and certainly not too late in the afternoon. You want those water droplets to dry off if you're watering with sprinklers. If you water with the drip system, it doesn't matter. Yes.
Do you find they need a lot of water?
They prefer it.
Okay, like a daily.
Right. So the official water requirements of a rose in our textbooks now is moderate. They like ample, they'll handle moderate. I mean, we were pleasantly surprised after the last 5-year drought that in our local parks, we saw a lot of things die, but the roses seemed to have made it. They didn't look good at all during the drought, getting 20-25% less water than they were. They weren't blooming much, they weren't growing much, but they made it. I would say all of them made it. But we're losing flax plants. Daylilies were dying. We were surprised that the roses were stronger than a lot of the other plants in that park. So,
So how much is moderate?
well, okay, so if you want your roses to be always growing and making flowers, you need to keep the soil moist about a foot deep. And that's hard to tell you how much water this because it depends not only on your rose, depends on the plants that are on your rose. If you got say a tree next to your rose, they can be sucking that thing dry, and your rose doesn't get the water. So the way you check that is you get a metal stick or a wooden dowel about as thick as a pencil or maybe as thick as your finger and see how far you can stick it in next to your rose. If you can push in the ground a foot deep, you've got a foot of moisture. If you can only push it down 4 inches, you only have 4 inches of soil wet enough for the rose to get the water out of it. So when they don't have a good 8 inches of moisture, they're going to just stop growing and stop making new roses. Uh, So if you want, and the other thing is they don't like hot dirt. So in the summertime, when we get into summer, if your ground is bare around your roses, that soil temperature where the roots are can hit well over 100 degrees, and that they look cooked. The rose plants look cooked. So what we like to do in the summertime is make sure either you have low plants underneath them, insulating the ground, or put some kind of bark on there.
Like mulch?
Mulch, anything 2 or 3 inches deep. I didn't bring a sample of around them to keep them cool. And then they look like spring all year. The ground looks cool. Like in these black plastic containers in the summer, our roses look cooked. They recover when it gets cold. They look cooked. I'm sure it kills some of the roots off. So yeah, so mulching deeply or having them in among other plants to keep the ground cool is very, very important. I mean, if you want to grow them in containers, wood containers works a lot better than black plastic in the summertime. In the wintertime, they grow a lot faster than black plastic. In a wood container, they would just be, slower growing when it's cold. So roses grow much faster in the heat than they do when it's cool. So in the summertime, so the recycle time on a rose, if this flower is done, you cut it off. It takes about 4 weeks in the summer to make a new flower, and about 8 weeks in the winter to make a new flower. The average is supposed to be 6 weeks between blooms on a typical rose. So you cut off a rose, they regrow another one in another 6 weeks. From bare root, it takes between because it's winter, between 8 and 12 weeks to make a flower, just because we cut them so short for bare root. It takes a little longer to get some strength going to make that flower.
When's a good time to lay down that mulch? Like, we don't want to do it now, right? When it's wet and we're gonna.
I'll go over that.
Okay.
We'll go over it right now. So traditionally in Southern California, it was tradition to prune your roses down, like to make them look like bare roses every winter. And then in the 80s, in the LA Times article saying, well, why do you guys do it so early when we do it in spring? And I thought to myself, well, that makes a lot of sense. Why don't I wait until spring to do it? So if you do it in December and you cut them back, now some years when we actually have winter, it gets so cold the leaves actually fall off and they stop blooming totally, so you do it then. But we haven't had any winter like that since say 1990 was the last time we had winters that would actually shut our roses down. I mean, late 80s, we had winters that were 30 degrees every night. Haven't seen that. Of course, that was unusual at that time. I didn't know it. I thought, because that's when I first started gardening in the 80s, and I thought, oh, this is normal. It's 30 degrees at night. And then I found out, no, in the 60s it wasn't like that. Even in the early 80s it wasn't like that. It was just like that in the late 80s when I started gardening. And it's never been like that ever since. So the roses grow right through the winters now. But when we get rain on the leaves, so if you cut them back in December, it takes them about a month to start growing leaves again, but it's still the rainy season. You get rain on these leaves and you get black spot and rust. So around May, I look at my roses and they're all covered with rust and black spot. I go, okay, I got to redo this, pull all the leaves off and start over again. Uh, so I started doing it in spring, so late March, early April. Now, if it's cool in March, I can wait till April. If in late March, like this year, we had 80-degree weather in February, so the roses got started real early. So you couldn't do anything about it. When you see that new growth just starting to come up all over, you cut them back. Get rid of all the old leaf at that time. But normally it is March, late March, early April when they really start pushing. So I'll cut off all the old leaves and cut the stems back to a shorter height. The rose plant probably doesn't really like you to cut them back that way. I mean, there was an interesting experiment done at Dining Gardens about 30 years ago when they had this new guy in charge of pruning the roses. He decided he would prune his roses like they do in England, which is to leave them tall. Well, let me show you a picture first. So the roses like we like to see them, like the American Rose Society loves them, is when you have a single center on a hybrid tea. This is hybrid tea roses. When you have a single center surrounded by a spiral of petals, kind of like this. The English roses, the English style roses were like this, where they have a confused center. And sometimes they have four distinct centers, like in this little rose here, there's four centers, that's a quartered rose. So they have this real massive amount of petals in there. So at the Gardens, the guy in charge in the 80s and 90s, he decided to leave his roses 4 feet tall in the winter. And he says, oh, we get way more rows in spring than you do if you cut them down to 6 inches high like they do at Rose Hills. They come down that high. And the hen gardens are leaving this high. So I went and looked at them. And the ones in Huntington Garden didn't look anything like the photos we have. They all look like English roses. They didn't have the spiral centers anymore. So apparently the way you prune them has a lot to do with the shape of the flower. So they were getting too many petals. They didn't look like the spirals anymore. They're like 50, 60 petals in there and they're all massed together. Well, this doesn't look right. So that's what happens when you don't prune them short. They get so strong, lots of petals in them, and then they don't look the same anymore. So I like the look cutting them real short. Got that spiral, and then the colors were correct. So it's interesting. You can make them change their whole character by the way you prune them. So in England, they like to leave them high. Dave Austin Roses of England says, "Don't prune my roses for at least 4 years. Just let them build up a lot of wood, get that petal count up." Yes.
So when you say you're pruning them down to 6 inches, is that just the old wood or everything?
So on roses, they make the typical flower you see in these photos in the catalogs. This is from new growth.
Okay.
You get your best. You get flowers that look like this when they make a new cane from the very base of the plant.
Okay.
The older the stem is, the less likely it is to look like that. So
So you don't cut the new canes, you cut the old.
you cut the old ones, yeah. So we like to see in the middle of winter at least 3 good canes. If you don't have enough canes on it, the rose plant can make even 20 canes in a year. I've seen that on Olympia, where they'll make 20 canes a year. And if they make that many new canes, the green ones are new canes. You just keep the new canes, you cut off all the old ones totally.
Okay.
If they don't do it, you have to leave the old canes. And some roses hate to make new canes.
So let's say you have like a majority of old canes, they're kind of gray, right?
Right, they turn
Almost like
gray,
wood.
they get
Yeah.
that crusty
Yeah.
bark on them. The new canes are just green.
And let's say you only have like 1 or 2 green canes. Is that like a bummer? Like, what do we do in that kind of situation?
You keep the old ones.
Okay, but then cut off the rest of the old ones.
Right.
We're aiming for 3.
Right. Well, 3 to 5 for a hybrid tea. If you have a floribunda rose, will go up to 8 or so. I mean, there's no rules here. There's no real rules. I mean, they used to have whole books written about pruning roses. And then when the rose craze went away and they had these huge rose gardens that they couldn't get anyone to prune, they started making pamphlets on how to prune roses with chainsaws. And the American Rose, I mean, in England, the Royal Horticultural Society, they wanted to prove that knowledgeable pruning was better than not. So they ran a test for 5 years. They had 50 roses on one side, pruned by the best rosarians in England. 50 roses over here, same kind, pruned by machines. They just cut off, deadheaded them with machines. And for 5 years, they counted the quality of roses on both sides, and they found no difference. So deadheading is important. So deadheading is when you pull off the rose that already bloomed. So, because the rose that already bloomed can spend a couple months making a little seed pod. That'll stop it from reblooming. So you cut off the old flowers once they're done. And apparently it doesn't make much difference. I mean, if you're in Minnesota, you don't cut off any leaf at all because you only have 4 months to grow rose. That rose plant needs every leaf it can get, so you don't do much. If you're a forest grower and you're in a controlled environment like in greenhouses, when you have a long stem on a rose, say here's a stem that grew about 2 feet to make this rose flower, they said they cut it down to the last 5 leaflet leaf on that stem. So these stems, they have each leaflet, this is a 5 leaflet leaf. And toward the tips, they often have only, here's one with 3. And toward the base of the stem, they may only have a 3 leaflet leaf. Those stems don't have enough, those leaflets don't have enough strength that the bud at the base of the leaf can't make a nice flower. So they'll tell you to cut it down to a 5 leaflet leaf. But there's no rules there. The further down you cut it, the longer that new stem has to grow to make a flower, and the longer it takes. But the bigger the flower, and the longer the stem, of course. The shorter you cut it, the more flowers you'll get sooner, but they'll be smaller flowers. In general, I mean, there's some roses that can make a really good flower with a real short stem. I mean, there's some exceptional roses out there. But
They need a lot of fertilizer, right?
Yeah. I mean, I just fertilize my roses once a year at my house. Yeah.
With the Osmocote?
No. So when I put my roses back in spring, cut them down, get rid of all the diseased leaves. You have to look at your stems too. Black spot and downy can cause blotch marks on your stem that are purple or reddish. You see those, cut below them because that can lead to more diseases. Mildew can cause some discoloration of stems too. It makes it all fuzzy and yellow. But cut off any diseased areas that you see. If you can, I mean, sometimes if the disease occurs right at the base of the stem, you just want to keep the stem until you get new stems and cut that one off later. But after I clean it up and get it all cleaned up, then I would also clean off all the dead flower petals and leaves that are on the ground, throw them in my compost pile or in my backyard somewhere. And then I'd cover the ground around my roses with about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch of some kind of compost.
When in the year is this?
In spring.
In spring. Start of spring.
Yeah. Now, when you plant bare roses, you can do it at that time. It's not a big deal. Whenever you cut them back. So I just cover the ground around them with this garden compost or some brand of nutritious compost around them about a 1/2 inch deep or so, which means one bag of that would cover about 3 roses, 2 or 3 roses, and then cover this with about 1 inch of bark or 1.5 inch of bark. And that's all I do for the entire year. And then the roses would just keep growing, keep growing, keep growing all the way through the year. And then the next spring I would do that again, just load them up with the compost, new layer of compost. If the bark was all messed up with too many dead leaves in there, I'd just scrape that off and throw in the backyard too. In fact, I would do that, clean off the whole bed, throw in the backyard of my fruit trees, put an entirely new coating of this stuff and the bark on top, and that'd be it for the next year.
When you say bark, you mean mulch, right? Like
Some kind of mulch to cover the compost that's more permanent. The compost by itself would shrink severely over time, but I would always want to keep the rose bed insulated, so I put bark on top to maintain that insulation layer the rest of the year.
But what do you mean by bark? Is that what you guys sell as mulch? Okay, just wanted to make sure that.
Yeah, we have one called bark mulch. That's the one I use on rose bed.
And you go outside of the basin with this?
You go though throughout. Well, just cover everything.
Like a good 2 feet around the
right.
rose.
I used a drip system on roses, so I didn't need a basin to water them.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Like where he, the well around.
So when we grow rose in containers, what we do here is just for ease of maintenance, we'll put them in our top pot. There's no room for any mulch on here. We'll just put in 2 tablespoons of Osmocote, and that'll feed them until they get sold. So this is a 6-month time release. Hopefully they're sold by that time. If not, we we refertilize them. Just so you know, this is really too small to grow most roses in. So by summer, this is marginal because the plants will be as big as this. And on a hot day, we'll have to water this twice to keep it wet enough on them. So if a lot of people grow roses in a 15-gallon for all their life, and that's fine. That's not bad. But a rose will really fill a half barrel, or some. This is a 20-gallon, which is close to half barrel size. They'll fill that. So in continue, you need something fairly large if you want to make it easy and not have to water too often. And again, the light colored plastic or wood will keep the roots cooler. But black makes them grow faster most of the year.
Where does the fertilizer go in? Like before the compost, after the compost, before the mulch, after the
We just throw it on top of the soil near the trunk.
But
So if you're in your bed, well, on your bed, if you're putting compost down, you don't need anything else. That is fertilizer.
Okay.
Just what form you want to use. So if you want to stay organic, compost would be the normal way of applying an organic fertilizer. It's nice, in the long run, organics are superior to chemical fertilizer. I mean, when I first started growing roses in the 80s, I was using something called Grow Power, which is an organic-based chemical fertilizer. And usually within 2 years, my roses would show signs of mineral deficiency. And so I thought, well, this says it's organic, but apparently it wasn't. It was an organic base, but it was a chemical fertilizer. So I switched to organic and never had a problem with any deficiencies showing up ever again. So if you go organic, you'll be fine. I mean, I forgot to bring it up, but we have an interesting fertilizer on the shelf. So this is an interesting chemical fertilizer developed by one of the Rose Society members, Tommy Cairns, I believe was his name, that developed this. So he volunteered, I guess, or worked at the Rose Hills in Whittier, and he analyzed the soil there and the water they were using and said, well, this is the fertilizer you need to complement your soil and your water. So and you can tell this was named by a guy, Rose. But so it works real well in Southern California. The problem with chemical fertilizers like this, water soluble, you have to apply it every couple of weeks or even every week to get the best results. Whereas, organic, one good dose, you're good. So, but it does work really well. He did a good job. So, okay, bug wise, we usually around February, April on the new growth, you get these little green bugs called aphids, and you get a lot of them. I mean, there could be 100 on the end of your stem, makes everything sticky. If you don't panic and just leave it alone, by the time the roses bloom, they're gone. And that's it for the year. They can't suck on the mature growth on a rose. They can only suck on the baby new leaves coming out. And once they mature, and usually by that time too, the ladybugs have found them, the lacewings, this syrphid fly. There's a lot of predators that eat aphids. So if you don't panic, you don't have to treat it. Back in the old days at the nursery, we didn't want aphids on a rose because people come look at it. They don't want to buy that one that's covered with aphids. So we'd spray it. And because we sprayed it with a chemical called orthine, every summer we get spider mites, which are way worse than aphids. So we found out, hey, if we don't spray with orthine, we don't get spider mites. So there are problem chemicals out there. Orthene is one, carbaryl is another. They promote aphid spider mites because they kill off the predators that eat them. So, my current house, I don't spray my roses, and I don't have to because for most things there are natural predators. Unfortunately, we have a few nowadays that don't, but for most things there are natural predators. So usually we get aphids around February, March, and if you just don't pay attention to them, they'll be gone before summer. Uh, if you want to treat them, the safest way is with one of the oil sprays. Neem oil won't kill 100%. Actually, I have another product in the back, Final Stop, that is a mixture of different essential oils, and that does a little better job than the single oils like these. Um, in the nursery, we use chemicals like these to control the aphids because generally we don't want to see them out there at all. The next bug that can come in is called a western flower thrip, which is an interesting critter in that it only likes light colored roses. So if you have a red rose, you'll probably never see a thrip on it, a western rose thrip in the spring. So right around March or April, I mean, every year it's been getting earlier because we get warmer earlier. It used to be around April, we'd see the edges of our petals would start turning brown. So you look inside the petals, there's all these little bugs in there. They're about the size of little slivers. They're colored, they're kind of tan colored. They're walking on your rose, and what's happening is right when the bud shows color, so this bud is still closed, this bud is now showing color. The adult thrip flies over here and lays probably 50 eggs on there. They'll hatch out, climb inside the petals, and start sucking. And by the time the flower opens up, all the outer petals have got brown edges. So back in the 80s, I'd go out there, try to treat them, and I figured out how to treat them. So if you have a real bad case, you cut off all these flowers and throw them out because they're all affected. The bugs are in there. So the life cycle is bugs. They're in there sucking on things. They drop off the flower, pupate in the ground for a few days, then come back, fly up, and hit the flowers again. So you cut off your flowers, throw them in the trash, and then every bud you see, you spray it, just the bud. Twice a week, whatever bud's now open, you spray it with, we have an organic product that works called spinosad soap. The one with soap and it works better than one without soap because roses are so waxy. If you get the other brands of spinosad without the soap, they just beat up and won't coat the flower properly. So just spray the bud. Now back in the 80s, we didn't have this product. We had an aerosol spray. They weren't too smart in those days. They didn't make sprays and things like this. So we had an aerosol. You get too close with an aerosol, you freeze the bud. So you had to stay about this far away so you wouldn't freeze it. But with this product, you just spray the bud, and go out there every 3 or 4 days for 2 weeks. You break that cycle, and then from that point on, during the rest of the spring, you're free of thrips. So I'd have to treat them for a 2 week period to get rid of all the thrips. Cut off the flowers that were ready where they're infested, spray all the opening buds, and 2 weeks later they were gone for the rest of the year.
Can you use Captain Jack's for that too?
Yeah, but it doesn't have the soap in it.
Oh, I see.
So it doesn't stick. That's the problem we're having with a lot of the products. This has got soap. It's more expensive than Captain Jack's. Now Captain Jack's, you can take the ready to use one, open it up, put 2 drops of soap in there.
Just like regular hand soap or dish soap?
Dish soap.
Dish soap.
About 2 drops, see if it sticks better. It may not work as well, but there are professional wetting agents that are on the market that make things stick better. So just be careful. There's one that if you put it on a rose, there's one wetting agent that I have on the shelf right now that I won't recommend by what's the name of the company? High Yield Company. It's phytotoxic to certain plants. It just makes roses grow really weird when you spray it on them. So we don't use that one at all. Okay, so that's flower thrips. Mildew is easy to control with oil sprays. So if you go out there with an oil spray every week and you see any mildew start to form, you spray oil on it, it controls it pretty well. We used to do so before we had a lot of the real serious diseases on the roses. We would mix oil and baking soda. Baking soda was 1 tablespoon of baking soda in our where we have the concentrate. I have the concentrate of this. So it was in a gallon of water. It was 1 tablespoon of baking soda in a gallon of water. I guess in here you can put 2/3 of a tablespoon or whatever that comes to 1.5 teaspoons in here. And that mixture of baking soda and oil would keep the bugs off, the disease, all the diseases off. I mean, we just sprayed our roses once a week with baking soda and oil. That's all we used. For 10 years, when I was taking care of the roses, that's all I used. The roses would look, the leaves would look real glossy from the oil, no bugs at all. I mean, we were in heaven for a while there until Downy came. We had to change everything we did, but and black spot. But for a while, that worked like a charm. And with the oil constantly. So mildew oil sprays work real good. Now, once if mildew's on there too long, like if you have white fuzzy leaves for 2 weeks, you got to clip that leaf off. You can't cure it. I mean, one time at my house, I had a rose that was real susceptible to mildew called Touch of Class, and I just left the mildew on her to see what the rose plant would do. And what it did is the buds sat there covered with mildew. They would never open. The plant wouldn't make any more. It would just sit there, sat there for 4 months, the same buds covered with mildew, nothing would open, it wouldn't move. So this is really odd. I thought it would grow some new branches or something. So I had to cut off all the mildew branches and then it just grew and started blooming again. But for 4 months, it just sat there with the mildew covered bud. That was wild. I thought it would just outgrow it, but it didn't. It might have if I just left it there forever, but I didn't have the patience, didn't want that in my garden anymore. So cut off the heavily, badly infected, mildew-covered leaves, and then spray them with the oil sprays to keep it off. And the oils are considered organic. All the stuff on the sides are organic. And if you only have one rose, you may never see mildew on it. In the summertime, we get all kinds of critters occasionally coming after your roses, eating the rose buds. So if you have a lot of roses, you'll probably get the little caterpillars, these horn earworms that just eat the bud out. So you get the spinosad out. Spinosad's good for thrips and anything that chews holes in leaves. Now, also any time of the year, you can get what are called rose slugs, which they usually start at the bottom of the plant. They start lacing the rose leaf out between the veins. You just get all these holes in your rose leaf. They're hard to see them because they're in the leaf. They're about the rose slug itself is that big and it's green. So I had one lady bring me a whole branch once. She says, "I got all these holes. What's eating them?" So I go, "Okay, there's one slug there. There's one slug there." I was just pointing them out on the leaves in her hand, all these things that she couldn't see. So they're hard to see them. They're not really caterpillars. So some of the caterpillar disease sprays like BT won't go after them. Spinosad will take care of them. So you spray them a couple times during the year if you see those holes and get rid of those. This is more common near the beach. You go to some garden near the beach. Everybody's got the rose slugs by the coast. Inland, not so much. Now, once we get hot, we got this new bug in town that came in about 5, 6 years ago now, called a chili thrip. This year was bad. Last year, not so bad. So, what we're not. Fortunately, we're not Florida or Texas where chili thrips will attack because of the heat. They seem to like consistent 80-degree weather to attack things. So, in Florida, it's like May through October. Yeah, they have to deal with this pest. Last year, we didn't see this thing till August because summer last year, not this year. Last year was cool, so we didn't see this bug till August, and we just had to deal with it for about a month. This year, it hit us late July because we were warmer this summer than normal. And what the chili thrip does, so the western flower thrip only goes after the petals. The chili thrip will go after the entire, all the new growth coming out when it's, you get all these new leaves that are forming. The chili thrip will attack them. It sucks on the leaves and pokes holes in them, sucks on them. So essentially, all your new growth is sliced and diced in the summer. So all your new growth doesn't develop. It just turns brown and shrivels up. A lot of people thought it's the drought. We're not watering enough. But no, it's this thrip. It's this new thrip that can attack the new growth on over 200 types of plants. Now, most plants aren't growing really fast in the summer, so you don't see the damage. We're seeing, chili plants, they get all this warped leaves on the top of them in the summer if they're growing fast. Tomato plants a little bit, but anything that's growing really fast and getting hit by this thing. But roses, it's devastating because your flower buds are at the tip. So a lot of people said, "Oh, my roses stopped blooming this last summer." So they bring in the stem, and you can't see bugs by sight on them at all. You just can't see them. So you get a piece of white paper, you slap that branch on them, and suddenly you see like 50 little black things, dark things walking around on off of one stem. There are that many on that stem. They're just hard to see them because they're we call it the contrast isn't good enough. Now, fortunately, spindle saddle is the best control for that, and it's organic. But if you use spindle saddle week after week after week, this kills, according to the research, 94% of all the thrips, all the chili thrips. So that 6% that this won't kill become the main population after a couple months. And this doesn't work so well anymore. So we recommend, if you want to do it organically, hit it with spinosad 1 week, hit it with neem oil or one of the oil products the next week. This only kills a few thrips. We hope it kills the few that doesn't kill. If you have a real bad case, you'll have to go to one of the chemicals on the off week. Spinosad still is as good as you're going to do, though. If it's got the wetting agent, the soap added to it, that does a good job. Now, my own house, I didn't spray them at all this year. I think I lost 1 or 2 rounds of roses in the middle of summer, and then by fall they were looking good again. This fall was cool. I mean, I would say October was 5 degrees cooler than normal, and so was November. So chili thrips disappeared really well. Well, we haven't sprayed these since September, and no sign of the chili. A little bit of sign on them, not much. I haven't seen on these. I don't see any sign at all. Any other questions? So if you have, I mean, in my old rose garden, I used a tank sprayer to spray them with, which is the most efficient way to spray things. But in my current house, I don't use anything. And I'll still get most of the roses still form and do okay with minimal care. So it just depends how good a job you want to do. Any other questions on roses? I didn't talk about the varieties at all. We have a little time left if you want to learn about. Anyone here need to know about the best roses or
I like a fragrant cutting rose, but pretty too. I think I bought a peach one from you and like a dark pink one.
Mhm.
What else would you recommend?
So on this list of roses we have the ones listed that are powerfully fragrant of the ones we're carrying. So that's always a nice list to look at. I mean, yeah, so a lot of roses, like Marilyn Monroe is a gorgeous rose, but the fragrance is, I mean, it has a scent, but it won't scent the whole house. I mean, there's some roses you put in your house and it's out in every room in your house because it's so strong. I mean, New Zealand is one of those. Chrysler Imperial is one of those. Peter Mayle.
And you're getting those like next month, you said?
Next week.
Next week.
Yeah, they're due to ship in. They're being shipped on the 19th, which is Monday, which means they'll either arrive late Monday, late Tuesday. Then we'll get them processed hopefully before Christmas. So.
And you probably run out pretty quick.
Well, we got shorted this year, so we ordered because of the drought. We decided to order 10, maybe 15% less than the year before. And then our rose growers told us for the first time in their history, they're sold out. They have more orders than they had roses. First time in history that both of our rose suppliers said that to us. So we actually didn't get maybe 30% of the roses that we ordered. From one grower, we couldn't get entire. I mean, my favorite rose, East Piaget, we ordered 40 last year, got 40 this year. We ordered 40, got 0. It's like, what? What? I don't get any.
And why is that your favorite?
Oh, it's gorgeous.
Yeah, it's an English style rose. You know, it's one's from France, but they're huge. There's like 80 petals. They're lilac pink. It's a nice strong color. They don't fade at all. They don't seem to get any disease at all. They don't get stuck in like a lot of the classic roses, like in the old days, there was Electron and Miss Honor American Beauty. They're so tightly wound that the humidity we have in the spring, they couldn't open. They wouldn't open. I mean, I remember in my yard, I couldn't get a good Miss All America rose till May because the petals were just stuck. The humidity was keeping them closed, and the same thing with Electron and a number of other roses. East Piaget with 80 petals, no problem. It just because it's not spiral like like the roses that are classic form roses. So it just opens even with those 80 petals, and it would bloom on a stem this long. It didn't have to grow like my Mr. Lincoln would have to grow 6 feet to make a flower. It's like,
Yeah, I think that's what I bought from you, Mr. Lincoln. I love it.
yeah. I mean, it has to grow 6 feet before it blooms. Olympia, 4 feet before it blooms. East Piaget, 6 inches, perfect flower. It does take East Piaget a few years to get the stem length up to a cutting, but then it would repeat really fast, and the flowers would last. The heat didn't bother them, the mildew didn't bother them, and it was super fragrant. I mean, it's just about the perfect rose, unless you like the spiral shape. It was just about the perfect rose. The pictures don't never do it justice because it's hard to capture that mauvey pink color it's got. So it's hard to capture that. Plus, I don't know, the form they show in pictures never would look right. I mean, it's Weeks roses grew it. Weeks always has like a portrait picture. So they would always show the rose at their prime. But the company that grows East Piaget, for some reason, they don't seem to do that. They always show roses with the open centers. So they show her picture of their East Piaget. It's like, okay, that looks like a mess. We don't understand why they don't want to make the roses look as good as they could. Well, this picture is better than the past, but still, they look better at that when they're.
It's not a carnation.
Yeah, but
It
it is,
looks like one.
and it's a little more blue than that's showing. You see it; it's got a blue tone to it,
Huh.
but the size, this is amazing. We are getting them in tree form this year.
Ooh.
We couldn't get the bushes. We ordered the trees. We're getting the trees, and when we get them on a tree, they're like that. They're just almost look fake.
Wow.
And there are a few roses in the past that have looked, they're just astounding. I mean, Peter Mayo. You look at a Peter Mayo rose. It's just incredible too. That's a nice rose.
What color is that?
It's a deep rose. It's not red. It's
Okay.
close.
Huh. Cool. But you don't have any right now.
No. Hopefully in 4 or 5 days we'll be fully stocked.
And you'll be like, there'll be a line out the door.
We hope.
Thank you.
Thank you.